evaluation of concussion. I'll try to be cognizant of time. Just want to talk a little bit about what's unique on the field as we go to evaluate the situations from, as Dr. Lobaz pointed out, a variety of different sports. Perhaps the most dramatic and well-known is that of National Football League games, but also just down to cheerleading or any of these other sports which all have the same potential sets of risk. What's unique about on the field? Well, decisions are somewhat time sensitive. There's a need for tools that reveal in a relatively quick and easy way whether the athlete is affected in the moment. And there are some potential variability among examiners. For example, not every game would have necessarily a physician there, but we would like every examiner to have some tools available to them that are readily used and reproducible from examiner to examiner. So whether it's a trainer, a coach, or an athlete's parent, or a potentially a medical professional, some common sets of understandings of what those tools might be. And then also there are unique factors in the immediate moments of the on-the-field situation where there may be competing interests about return to play. You know, some people may want that athlete right back in. Others may be more willing to undergo a prolonged evaluation or a more substantive evaluation. In 2013, in response to the NFL's, I'll just use the word crisis/interest in concussion, trying to get a better understanding of what was happening with the athletes, the NFL started the unaffiliated neurotrauma consultant. For many years, there have been team physicians who are outstanding physicians and are very much engaged in the process of evaluating and protecting these athletes from a variety of injuries. But at the same time, it was felt that it was reasonable to put a program in place where there would be a less affiliated individual evaluating the athletes. And so in this program, at each game, the NFL brings in 2 unaffiliated neurotrauma consultants, and these may be neurologists or neurosurgeons who are on each sideline, and their duty is to be an independent voice in relation to the evaluation of the athlete. And they make recommendations, although the team physician still has that final call, which is something that is important, and that the team physicians know these athletes very well. There's a mandated training process, so each affiliate or independent affiliate comes in and goes through a training process on the procedures and practices in the games, and then also the concussion assessment tools that the NFL prefers to use. And of course, each opportunity is a little bit different in terms of evaluation. This is really a collaborative effort. There's the trainers, the team physicians, the injury spotters, and they collaborate to try to discern not only the obvious injuries, the player who's unconscious on the field, but also the less obvious injuries. And a part of that relates to a program which they call the Eye in the Sky. There's an injury spotting team at each game, and they are actually actively looking and scanning the whole field. As you can imagine, any one trainer or coach does not have a complete perspective on the full 100 yards of the field. So again, this Eye in the Sky individual can call down. There is a shared and common set of headsets that the teams use. Can call down and say, listen, player so-and-so, when they got up, they actually didn't walk towards their sideline. They started walking to the other sideline first, and then that kind of warning system of making sure that small, subtle distinctions are detected. So on the field, there's of course the primary survey, airway, breathing, circulation in the context of any loss of consciousness. And if that's normal, proceeding on to a sideline assessment. Of course, if the loss of consciousness persists, or there's concern about a cervical injury or a cranial fracture, that's an immediate transport to a pre-designated trauma center in the city in the field of play. For the sideline assessment, the player's down, or has been down perhaps, but the primary survey's okay. Then any of these factors could prompt a sideline assessment. A player concern, the player may come up to the coach and say, listen, I've just noticed this or this. Team staff concern, injury spotter, the UNC concern as the independent. Any of those individuals, all they have to do is raise their hand and will prompt a sideline assessment. Now, if you look at what are the spotters looking for, this survey from Major League Soccer, and I know the print is hard to see, but of course there are the obvious things, the player down, but also confusional factors or other types of symptoms that you might suspect would be a cues as to whether or not an injury may have occurred. And then once that concern is raised, there's an opportunity to do some screening right on the sideline, but also the locker room is an extension of that sideline in essence, because if you need to do a more detailed evaluation that may take 15 or 20 minutes, then you're off to the locker room to complete that in a quieter place. Now, Dr. Lobatz pointed out the importance of the baseline evaluations. So all of the athletes undergo a baseline evaluation. There's an iPad app that is, again, the NFL's version of what was called the SCAT, or Standardized Concussion Assessment Tool. The original SCAT came out in the mid-2000s, and we've had updates subsequently. The current version, SCAT 3, came out in 2013. These tools look something like this. There's sort of a paper version and an iPad version, and there's an assessment, again, at baseline of your risk factors. We heard earlier in the talk from Mike that if you had a prior history of concussion, your risk was higher for future concussions. So there's a history of how you've been as an athlete, some of your background, family history.
Crosby Center, San Diego,
at
California.
Baseline, and then throughout the season, in the context of any game that comes up, there is a post-concussive symptom assessment. And as you can see on this wide variety, the scores are rated from a severity of 0 to 6, and it's things like headache, neck pain, dizziness, confusion, don't feel quite right. Going on down, there's quite a list of symptoms. Each one of those is rated on a 6-point scale, and they're totaled up. Now you can imagine that this is actually a little bit time-consuming, a little bit complicated to do. The iPad app kind of helps, and the athletes get used to doing this because this is done throughout the season. These symptom complexes do correlate with imaging, so patients or individuals that have more of these symptoms, when follow-up imaging is done, show alterations in brain activation, either on functional MRI or on other advanced imaging modalities that we just heard about. And so there is a sense that the more of these symptoms and the more severe they are, of course, the likelihood of a concussive event is stronger. I point out this issue of baseline. Baseline testing is important because baselines are different in different populations. So if you look at this graph and look at simply the baseline set of symptoms between college athletes, high school athletes, men and women, there are differences. And so for an individual, if you really want to have a sense of where they are, you've got to do that baseline testing pre-season preferably. The physical signs that are looked for relate obviously to cervical injury, and of course that's an important initial screening. And that's part of the NFL's Standardized Concussion Assessment Tool. And then also the SAC, or the Sideline Assessment of Concussion. And this has to do with looking for signs of orientation, some small tasks related to concentration. So numbers forwards and backwards, remembering certain sequences of vocabulary type words that have been given, and then follow-up testing of those. So it's an initial kind of an orientation assessment. Some of these kinds of questions that you may have heard people commonly ask: what field are we on today? Which team are we playing today? What quarter is it? Who scored last? Who had the ball last? These will be general screening questions that will be asked. There's a balance evaluation that has come into play in the NFL's assessment as well. This involves typically 3 20-second timed balance assessments and different types of balance: eyes closed, raising, coming up on one foot. See, I'm not very good at that one here on the stage. But these types of assessments then are scored for how many times you fall off, either step to the side or have to open your eyes to correct your balance, and there's a scoring mechanism that can be done for that, correlating again with a sensitive detection of concussion. So SCAT 3, what all is included at this time? There's a Glasgow Coma Scale, which is a very gross overview, of course, of consciousness. There's a symptom scale that I talked about, the SAC. There's also the balance examination. And then finally, in emerging, there's an increase in interest in the use of visual testing. The SCAT 3 evaluation I've looked, I have not been able to find a very good online version of SCAT3. There is a nice iPhone app for SCAT2. If you want such an app available to you. Of course, the forms are available through the standardized concussion assessment tool website, and you can download these and go through these each individual component. There's also a child version as well for younger individuals, and that's an important thing to remember. So sideline assessment, we've talked a little bit about this, Glasgow Coma Scale. The quick orientation screen, another favorite is the Maddox score, which is, again, more of those orientation types of questions, and that's a component, again, of SCAT3. Here on the left, we see the symptom scale, and then over on the right, the cognitive and physical evaluation, again, with the components of the standardized assessment of concussion, memory tests, numbers, again, forward and backward, and that type of thing. Balance exam. Again, we briefly mentioned that, a sequence of testing on balance, and then coordination examination, and then the SAC at the end of it has a delayed recall. To go through that whole thing is probably going to take about 20 minutes. So again, that's where you're moving off the field into a different area for evaluation. Importantly, for the SCAT, one of the things that's nice is it gives very clear examiner instructions to try to increase the reproducibility. It tells you exactly how to ask the questions and exactly how to proceed through the examination. So we've talked about these scales. The sort of the overarching theme of, say, SCAT is to bring in several different scales, the cognitive assessments, the balance, the physical assessments. What do they actually tell us about whether a person's had concussion? So if you look at the symptom scores generally, so again, a rating, and if you have a bump up in the increase in both the number of symptoms from your baseline and the severity of baseline, sensitivities tend to run in the 90 to 100% range with specificities in the 60 to 80% range. The SAC score itself, which again is that concentration component, generally again 80 to 90% sensitivity. Neuropsychological testing, of course, obviously additional sensitivity there. The balance sensitivity is in the moderate range, but has a very high specificity, and then also some of the other tests. So I think what you see from this is nothing's perfect, and all of them provide some information. A global view, as was described, bringing and integrating a variety of data points is probably the most important way to do it. Now, if you look at the symptom scale itself, as Dr. Lobat said, on the bottom left here, you see the graph with the decline in symptoms. And by 7 to 10 days, you've got a very dramatic decline in the typical symptoms that you might have noticed at the acute on-field evaluation. And then hopefully, again, for several weeks out, for almost all patients, those have largely resolved. So the psychometric properties of the post-concussive symptom scale tend to run like this. If there's a 3 to 5-fold increase in the number of symptoms, and you remember that big long list with something like 30 different symptoms, and a 6 to 8 point overall higher severity score, that correlates with roughly a 60 to 90% sensitivity and a relatively high specificity. So that's what you're kind of looking at for that particular scale. For the standardized assessment of concussion, and again, this was the one that has the concentration type of tests. Typically, you see an average drop in a concussed patient of about 4 points on that scale. And again, you can refer back to the forms to get the exact scoring. But even a drop of 1 point or more from baseline had a pretty high sensitivity and specificity for detecting concussion. And so that tends to normalize relatively quickly in most patients, but that's an on-field assessment that's relatively quick that can give you a sense of what might be going on. The Maddox scale, which is what quarter is it, or who scored last, or those types of questions, generally a pretty low sensitivity, but there is a little bit of information that comes out of that.
Crosby Center, San Diego, California.
So the BESS, or the Balanced Air Scoring System, again, this was the 3 20-second trials, and what you're doing is, you can see in the pictures, you're either standing like this, or you're bringing up one leg, or you're going with one leg in front of the other, trying to hold for 20 seconds, eyes closed. So what gives you a point? If you open your eyes, if you stumble, if the hands come off the hips, trying to correct for balance, moving, basically any of these things can give you a point. If you do score points, In that scale, oops, let me go back. A best score of 21 or more was highly correlated with the development of, or the notification of a concussion-like state. King-Devick test, I want to mention this. Increasingly, we see that there is a certain subjectivity in things like symptom scale. One athlete might say, oh, I don't have a headache, or I don't really feel anything. Another might say, well, yeah, I kind of feel a headache. You can kind of get the sense that some of these are a little bit subjective. They talk about symptoms. BESS is a bit better than that because it's really a physical test with physical measurements of not doing that. That's your balance scoring system. King-Devick is another ophthalmological test or an eye test that is designed to bring a certain standardization to the detection of concussion. One of the advantages of King-Devick is that it can be done pretty quickly, and I'll talk about that. But basically what it is it measures your eye saccades as you move over a series of lines and count numbers out. And in doing that, you're assessing both the ability to concentrate, the ability to have eye movements that don't give you blurry vision, and proceeding through. And it's increasingly, and there's kind of an emergence in the last 2 years in the literature of this particular test for rapid detection of concussion. I'll just show you kind of what the forms look like. The very first form that you do at baseline preseason is you show a patient this, and then they have to count out the numbers. I don't have my glasses on today, but I'll try. Let me come down here, actually. So 2, 5, 8, 3, 9, 4, 6, 8, 3, 6. So you demonstrate to the athlete how to go through the forms. And then this is the first real form. So the actual test involves proceeding through 3 forms sequentially. So it would go like this: 2, 5, 8, 0, 7, 3, 7, 9, 4, 6, 5, 3, 1, 6, 4. You see, it gets a little tough after a moment. The next one, you don't have the guiding lines, so the athlete has to do it without the guiding lines. And then in the last one, the numbers kind of stagger and come a little closer together. Now, what was seen in this is it had a very high predictability in terms of predicting concussion in patients that had gone through this test and then had a deviation of greater than, say, 4 or 5 seconds from their baseline. So this was a study that just came out last year from one of our former neurosurgeons at UC San Diego, he's now involved with some concussion assessment on the island of Guam. And these were 13 high school athletes, and what you see is the results on the King-Devick test from baseline and 3 different games. And I've highlighted in red 3 of the athletes who showed in certain games deviations above. So athlete number 4 went from his 42-second baseline to go through all 3 of those cards that I was just demonstrating. And then he, after game 1, had experienced a bump up to 48 seconds. And this was clinically correlated with a concussive event in that athlete. Athlete number 1, similarly in the 3rd game, also had a bump up. And then athlete number 8 didn't have a baseline, but that particular athlete did correct to a better state later, and that also correlated with a concussive event in that particular athlete. So I think, I hope you'll pay attention to King-Devick in the literature, because I think it's kind of interesting. What on-field markers of concussion predict the poorest subacute outcome? I'm not talking about the long-term outcome, but kind of that initial subacute outcome in the first few days. So impact testing, if you use that particular form of testing, 2 days post-injury, a 10-point increase in symptoms or a 10-point decrease in memory. Poor outcomes, 3 days post-concussion. So if you demonstrated retrograde amnesia, you're more likely by about 10-fold to have a poor outcome in the first 3 days after concussion. If you demonstrated anterograde amnesia, a 4.2-fold increase in the likelihood of a poor outcome at 3 days post-concussion. And then a brief loss of consciousness that was not necessarily associated with good or poor in this particular analysis. Dizziness, interestingly, was an important symptom and had more predictive value than early poor subacute outcome. I'm not talking again about long-term outcome. I'm just talking about the fact that on the field, if you were dizzy in the aftermath of your injury, you had a higher risk, about 6-fold higher risk, of having a poor subacute outcome in those first few days after the event. So other predictors of early post-concussive impairments, the elevated symptom score, the lowered SAC score, deficits in the balance analysis. histories in terms of predictors in your history, a history of concussion. And this is what 3 Class 1 studies have shown this, and 2 Class 2 studies have shown this, that the history of concussion is important in terms of predicting a more severe, prolonged post-concussive impairment after this initial injury. So I'll close with this little case history. This was a case, it was a preseason game, and so in the preseason, the athletes are kind of on the line for, are they going to make the team? This could be a multi-million-dollar decision for a given athlete as to how they're performing in the preseason. This was an individual who in the first half of a pro preseason game, he was the leading tackler. Things are looking very good for staying on the team. Halftime complaint of having felt foggy and experienced nausea, no headache, and the NFL SCAT, which we went through earlier on the iPad app, was normal. The team physician diagnosed a concussion. The player disagreed, wanted to go back out for the second half, calls the UNC, that's me, and says, hey, can you come to the locker room and evaluate this patient? Actually, the team physician called and said, the athlete and I have a disagreement. What do you think? And so the question is, what's next? We can talk about, what's next for an individual athlete like that, but clearly the idea of the UNC in the pro games now is to have that independent voice be able to make a statement. I won't talk too much about return to play, but in terms of return to play, I think we'll hear a little bit later about the graded way that we allow those symptoms to resolve and then slowly increase the physical activity on patients before letting them come back into the playing field. I think that's all I have today, so I'll be happy to take some questions and hope you have a great break right after. Let's see, any questions? There's one.
Are not hired full-time at the school, they're part-time at best, sometimes per diem. I'll work one night a week just for varsity games, for example. So what would you recommend we do even a locker room to evaluate somebody? So just sideline. It gets difficult when there's no baseline. The athlete may go down on the field after a head impact with a headache, but magically is better, symptom-free. Objective-wise, what would you recommend we do first if we can't go through the entire SCAT-3 and take 20 minutes?
Sure. So what I understood from the question is, this is an athlete that may have had a headache on the field, but now back in the locker room is feeling better. And the question is, what would be one of the useful tools you might choose at that moment?
Right, like in San Diego Unified, if they have a headache for 0.1 second, you're supposed to say, you're done for the day.
Yeah.
Which I always err on the side of caution, of course, anyway, but I just want to hear what you had to say about that.
No, I agree with that. I had a classic example. I had a friend call me out, varsity volleyball player in a North County high school, was on the recipient end of a forehand smash, the volleyball hit her right in the nose, saw stars, a little bit of a headache, and then, the nose was a little swollen, but felt great, supposedly, right afterwards, or great. So it comes up, what do you do in that situation? As you say, a very transient set of symptoms, and not necessarily, no baseline, no SCAT, no iPad app, none of those great things that the pros have. I understand what you're asking. And so at baseline, my feeling is conservatism is a useful thing to bring to that context. Why? Just because, I believe that sometimes in the heat of the moment, even for those first few minutes, there's not necessarily there's so much adrenaline that's going, you've just been in the match or the sport, and you may actually need a bit of time to allow things to sort out just for a few minutes, and then get an assessment, even 15, 20 minutes down the road. Okay, how are you actually doing at that point? In terms of the tools, I think it's useful for any trainer or medical professional to get familiarized with one or two of these tools that they feel really good about as a screen. But I believe it's a global picture. If I was to say, if a school, some of these tools, as you know, are proprietary and cost money. So a school may invest in Impact, or they may invest in the King Devitt. If you have access to that, that's great. If you don't, I believe that if you take at least the screening symptom score, and if any of those were or are positive, it's reasonable to pull out for that day and just take the conservative approach. Maybe I just haven't been enough with athletes that are pushing to get back in, but that's my feeling. Just stay conservative.
I'm from the Central Valley in Fresno, and it's a huge, huge problem with clearing kids too soon. We work at the Level 1 Trauma Center. We see the kids with second impact. We see the kids who can't repeat 3 numbers because they were cleared too soon. Unfortunately, it's not the neurosurgeons, not the neurologists that are seeing these kids every day. It's the primary care physicians, the pediatricians that don't have a certain level of training in these areas. Other than the certification in brain injury, there's not, as far as I understand, there's not like a clear, defined level of training that a physician or medical professional should have to be competent to manage sports-related concussions. So, in your opinion, what do you think that level of training should be?
I think the nice thing is we're going to have Dr. Van Busker talk a little bit about just this issue in the next talk, if I'm correct, Mike.
That's correct.
And I think let's defer to Dr. Van Busker's discussion, but it's an incredibly important thing. And one of the reasons you see that that's important is the rise in the desire to have conferences like this where people are coming together to promulgate a common understanding of what should we do in terms of getting an athlete back to the field. And we've all seen that exact scenario you described. One last question, and then we'll break. Yes?
Thank you. In terms of the sensitivity of the King-Devick measure or test, how sensitive it is, because it seems from all the tests you've described, it's the less subjective, and we know that most of the
Dr. Moses, Crosby Center.
in the game and deny any symptoms. So it seems to me, at least, that it's very promising. But my question is, how sensitive it is?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll be brief. So I think there's interest in this at the pro level. The NFL and the CFL have collaborated to try a baseline King-Devick this past season in the CFL. It's not being done in the NFL just yet, but they are evaluating it. And I've just seen now in the last 2 years more studies that have come out at the collegiate level with baseline King-Devick testing. The sensitivity looks pretty high, maybe 85%, 90% for detection of concussion. One of the most impressive studies I saw was a study where actually a number of individuals who were felt to be really rather symptom-free from the standard measures, they just failed King-Devick completely and ultimately were assessed and diagnosed with concussion. So I think it's something to watch. Not quite ready it's not quite out there in great numbers yet, but I think it's a very interesting test. Okay, hold on.
Thank you, Dr. Carter.